I apologize in advance because I have a cold, so if I sniffle during my presentation, I apologize. So this week we read a lot about sexuality across the lifespan, and one thing I thought was really interesting was the idea of the grandmother hypothesis, especially because my paternal grandmother lived with us for most of my life, and she actually passed away earlier this year, so I've been thinking about her a lot this year. The study that I'll be looking at is called Grandma Plays Favorites, X Chromosome Relatedness and Sex-Specific Childhood Mortality. It was written by Fox et al. In 2010, and they're a German group, which is why favorites is spelled a little weird. The main question that was looked at both in the chapter and also in this study was, what is the purpose of living past one's reproductive years? As we learned, menopause occurs in the late 40s to early 50s, and many women live up to almost their 80s, especially in the United States. So what's the purpose of those 3 decades where women aren't able to have children? One hypothesis that has come up because of this is the grandmother hypothesis, which postulates that postmenopausal women can increase their genetic contribution to future generations by investing in the survivorship of their grandchildren. One way that it's been postulated that this occurs is by increasing nutritional support. So for example, in hunter-gatherer populations where mothers were busy taking care of their children whom they were breastfeeding and didn't have the time to hunt for, look for food or get tubers from the ground, healthy grandmothers were able to do this and increase the survivorship of their grandchildren that way. However, many studies that have looked at this have reported conflicting results. Most studies show that the presence of a maternal grandmother has a positive impact on grandchildren. However, the impact of the paternal grandmother has had varied results. Some show that it has a positive result, some show that it has a negative, and some show that it has a net neutral result. And one way that many studies have thought about this is through the idea of paternal uncertainty, suggesting that why would a paternal grandmother invest in her grandchildren if she's not even sure that they really have her genes? Fox et al. Had another idea for this. What they looked at was the influence of X chromosome relatedness on the survivorship of grandchildren, and whether this happens in a sex-specific way. Before I go into the methods of the study, I thought I would first go over the genetic kind of way that X chromosome is passed down from grandmother to grandchild. So first, let's look at the case of the paternal grandmother. Here, if she has a son, that son has a 50% chance of getting the yellow X chromosome that you see here. If he then goes on to have a son, that son has no chance of getting the yellow X chromosome because he'll be getting his X chromosome from his mother, which means that he has an overall 0% X chromosome relatedness to his grandmother. On the other hand, if he has a daughter, that daughter is definitely going to get the yellow X chromosome from her father, which means that she will be overall 50% related by X chromosome to her grandmother on the paternal side. On the other hand, let's look at the case for the maternal grandmother. Here, just as before, the maternal grandmother has a 50% chance of getting the purple X chromosome from her mother. Sorry, the mother has a 50% chance of getting the purple X chromosome from her mother. And if she goes on to have a son, she has a 50% chance of passing on the purple X chromosome to her son, and another 50% chance of passing on that purple X chromosome to her daughter, which means that both the son and the daughter are 25% related by X chromosome to their maternal grandmother. That was a little confusing, so I've kind of put it together here, along with the idea of autosomal inheritance. So as we know, of course there's X chromosome inheritance, but on average your 25% of your X chromosomes also come from one of your grandmothers. And so when you take those two things, X chromosome relatedness and autosomal relatedness, into account, there's a differential in how related you are to your grandmother. In this case, your paternal grandmother and granddaughter are the most related, with a total relatedness of 31%. And the paternal grandmother and her grandson are the least related, with the total relatedness of 23%. The maternal grandmother and her grandchildren are both 25% related, and are both in the middle. As you can see here, what Fox et al. Hypothesized, was that having a paternal grandmother around with her granddaughter would be the most beneficial, and having the paternal grandmother with her grandson would be the least beneficial. Now let's go on to the methods. what Fox et al. Did was they took data from parish records, from census records, and from other church records as well, that looked at whether the grandmother was present or absent while a child was growing up. They looked at this data from 7 different countries, including Canada, England, Germany, Japan, Gambia, Ethiopia, and Malawi. And they took this data from the late 1600s to almost the 2000s, so it's spanning several centuries. What they found was really interesting. As you can see here, on the y-axis we have the grandmother, so paternal and maternal, and on the x-axis we have the odds ratio of grandchild survivorship. Basically what this means is how positive or negative an impact a grandmother had on how likely her grandchild was to survive. So here on the right side, you can see that if the bar is on the right side, it means that the grandmother had an overall positive effect, and if the line is on the left side, it means that the grandmother had an overall negative effect on the child. I'll go through each of the countries, and I want you to look for a general trend. As you can see here, the paternal grandmother had a negative impact on her grandson. This means that if the paternal grandmother was around, she was detrimental to the survival of her grandson. As you can see here in England, the same effect occurred. A paternal grandmother hurt the chances that her grandson would survive. This occurred in Ethiopia as well, and in Canada, and in Japan. In Gambia, it was a little bit different in that the paternal grandmother had a negative effect on both her grandsons and her granddaughters. And in Malawi, the paternal grandmother had a negative effect on her grandson, and the maternal grandmother had a negative effect on her granddaughter. That was a lot of data, so it's summarized right here. As you can see, in all 7 countries, boys survive better with their paternal grandmother than with their maternal grandmother than with their paternal grandmother. As you might remember, boys are 25% related to their maternal grandmother and 23% related to their paternal grandmother. So that difference is reflected here. Additionally, the paternal grandmother was better for girls than for boys. Again, the paternal grandmother was 31% related to girls and only 23% related to boys. And there was a very significant sex-specific effect, which had a p-value of 0.0046, which shows that paternal grandmothers really hurt boys in survivorship and really helped girls in survivorship. Of course, a study like this does have its limitations. It's a very new study. It's the first study of its kind, and so as such, it needs to be replicated. There's also the idea that because it was over so many different countries, that cultural differences in the different countries might have contributed to the slight differences that we saw in some of the countries. However, given that it was with 7 countries and over such a long time span, and that there was such a robust impact and influence, this suggests that it must be something that's evolutionarily mediated, and not just, some sort of cultural byproduct. How does this happen? One way that it's postulated to occur is through behavioral adaptations. Specifically, there have been many studies that show that physical resemblance might lead to favoritism, right? So grandmothers whose grandchildren look like them, they might be more likely to favor them. There's also been an idea postulated that perhaps pheromones also play a role. So grandmothers might feel more favorable feelings in response to certain grandchildren than others, and that might lead to more nurturing behavior on part of the grandmother. Regardless of how it occurs, there's a very significant conclusion to be reached here, which is that the effect that a grandmother has on her grandchildren parallels the X-relatedness between them. Thank you.